might live and breathe the gospel of Jesus Christ. Amen. So before we delve back into our scripture readings for today, we're going to revisit the question from our children's sermon for a couple of minutes. We'll dig a little deeper into it while we let our scripture marinate for a bit. During that time, we asked what our most cherished memories are, or our earliest memories. Memory, as we all know, is absolutely overflowing with meaning. Sometimes nostalgia, sometimes deeper meaning. It's an incredible gift that we have. It enables us to cherish our present and our future moments as well. I know personally that I look forward to creating many good memories once our little daughter arrives, and perhaps a few stressful memories too. Memory and time remain among the greatest mysteries of God's creation, and it's our pleasure to ponder them as we worship and attempt to spread the truth of Christ's gospel. So once again, that question is, what is your absolute earliest memory? Do you still know what it is? Has that earliest memory ever changed on you? Has something else that you maybe forgot been awoken inside you? Some experience you maybe thought you had lost? Do you have multiple earliest memories, the order of which you're not quite sure about anymore? Well, I am at a point in my life where I can still remember my childhood pretty well. During the past decade, at times, I've felt further and further removed from that childhood, but now as we anticipate becoming parents, and perhaps as we accumulate lots and lots of children's books and baby supplies, I'm feeling closer to that childhood once again, as if I'm finally able to revisit it in my mind. It's kind of a weird thing to be able to do, but something I'm very grateful for. I know a lot of you are probably thinking, oh, boo-hoo, you're 30 and you're so far removed from your childhood. So my earliest childhood memories are a little vague. I do have a couple, though, that I point toward. And each of them, oddly, is kind of staged in the same way. The first one is toddler Ian running out into the snow in our backyard in Grand Rapids, where I was born and I lived until the age of 3. After I run out, I turn and I look back, and I see the faces of my parents smiling at me. And I believe my brother Rob is there somewhere in the snow too. Now, the way I describe it, it makes it sound a little more vivid than it actually is. Being my earliest memory, it's still pretty vague, save for those few details. Now, my second earliest memory occurs shortly after that one, and the blocking is kind of the same. It's this time we are in the driveway of our new house in Durham, North Carolina, and I had lived here from age 3 to 5 while my dad went to seminary at Duke. So we are arriving at our new house, or perhaps having just recently arrived, and toddler Ian is running up the driveway toward the garage, and he stops, and he turns and looks back, and he sees his parents watching him. And of course, I imagine them smiling at me. And my brother was probably around somewhere for that one too. There's no snow in North Carolina, but these two memories are still pretty similar. So we all have this moment, or these couple of moments. We all have these vague recollections from the earliest times in our lives. And it's such a curious thing to be able to revisit them and perhaps for a moment lose ourselves in them. For us, these are the first. But there is perhaps another example to this dynamic, this mystery of memory and time. And it gives us a couple more tricky questions to answer. So we talked about our first memories, but what would you say is your last memory or your most recent memory? That's kind of a strange question. It's like asking what was the last thing you did before you got here. Maybe you think about eating breakfast or brushing your teeth, hopefully, before leaving for church. But these aren't really memories, are they? These are just kind of things that we did earlier in the day. Now, sometimes you'll have a day where you get to the evening, you look back at what you did that morning, and it feels like a long time ago, like a completely different day or week. But perhaps we should rephrase it and say, what memories have you made recently? What was the last thing you did that you expect to stay with you for a long time? Or if we can take this a step further, what do you suppose your final good memories will consist of? That might be a kind of scary thing to think about. It's like asking whether you can remember what happened right before you fell asleep or something. But with all this in mind, all these questions and these ideas, it can be fascinating to realize how fluid the nature of time really is. And if we can, before we get to our scripture, if we can just stay philosophical for one more moment, we can ask ourselves, when does the past become the present? What is the present? How far back in our minds does it reach, and how far forward? When does the present become the future? When do the current moments become memories, and when do perhaps the insignificant moments or the non-memories get left behind? And finally, and most importantly, the reason we're here, what does this say to us about the nature of God and Christ, and about the truth of the gospel? So let us get back to our scripture now. We've got two juicy passages to work with today. So we'll start with the gospel. That's where we're getting our sermon title from. And we are talking about the first and last. This scripture teaches us that these two things, these differing statuses, it teaches us through this parable from the Gospel of Matthew, the workers in the vineyard. The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner, we are told, who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. Landowner promises them a single denarius for the day. This was a common coin of the time, a sort of Roman predecessor to the many coins that have been used throughout Western history for currency. It's made mostly of silver. It's worth about $3. These were the day's wages. But the landowner doesn't stop with these workers. He also finds people to work for him at midday. He finds others for him in mid-afternoon. And he finds still more toward the evening, toward the end of the workday. And every single one of them receives a full day's wages. Naturally, the workers whom he had hired in the morning are upset. They feel they should have been paid more than those hired toward the evening. But the landowner responds simply, in so many words, hey, this is what you agreed on. It's my money. I'll do what I want with it. It's not hurting you if I give them the same amount, or something like that. And Christ concludes by giving us the official lesson, right? The through line of this parable. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. We talked about it a little bit earlier in our children's sermon, what that can mean. It's a tricky statement, and we'll revisit it in just a moment. We did have another passage, our New Testament lesson. And Paul, in this passage, is kind of working through a few things while we watch, while we read along. Perhaps he's having a bit of a spiritual crisis. Perhaps he's having some survivor's guilt or something. He tells us of his desire to depart from this world and to be with Christ. And that this desire has him feeling conflicted between the fruitful labor of life and the, shall we say, joyful release of death. Now, I think most of us have a kind of hard time relating to this, even though we do believe that we will be reunited with Christ. Even though we believe that Christ is the first and last, the Alpha and the Omega, we are not yet ready to depart from this life until we have lived it fully, long, and well. Additionally, most of us would come to the same conclusion as Paul, that there is yet work to be done in this world. Paul's articulation of this problem is maybe a little self-centered for my taste. Paul seems to think that he's staying around for the rest of our benefit rather than for his own. But he does acknowledge that his struggle is also our struggle, and the struggle of the Philippians to whom he writes. And he acknowledges that this struggle is ongoing, unfinished, unending. He understands that this faith journey, as we sort of acknowledged last week, it is an enduring one. Last week we talked about a sort of cycle, a cycle of forgiveness and redemption and deliverance, and about how the acceptance of Christ into our lives cannot only occur in one moment. Now, certainly moments like conversion or baptism can and should stand above others, but this is still a continuous process. And this is why it is so important that we acknowledge God and Christ as being present in all things and at all times. God and Christ are the first and last. They are the Alpha and the Omega. This is why it is so important that we understand that fluidity, the fluidity of the kingdom of heaven, and the unconditional, radical grace by which we are all granted access to it. Time is no object to God. Time is no object to Jesus. For Christ, there is no first and there is no last, for they are one and the same. Now, in the context of our scripture, we'll go back to our gospel for a moment. The meaning of this statement, it's not always clear in the context of the scripture. It can be tricky. The last shall be first and the first shall be last. It can come across as a little ominous, actually, because particularly for those of us who have spent our entire lives in the church, or those of us who may have accepted Christ at a young age. But it does not mean that those of us who are in that category will suddenly be forgotten or left behind. Nor does it mean that anyone who has accepted Christ at a later stage in life should ever be thought of as last. It's not a statement about status. On the contrary, it means that under Christ, all things are equal. Under Christ, the first and the last are both welcome and both forgiven and both beloved. They are one and the same. And just as our memories seem to change and flow, just as our experiences and our very concept of time can change and become fluid, so too is that nature of God and that reality of God's creation. In this kingdom, there is no first and last, except for the presence of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God. Amen.